on our 2008 enterprise server, and we're going to set up network address translation, or NAT, and a VPN server and client. Now, network address translation allows you to take a public IP address, one single public IP, and share that among many private IP addresses, and it also hides those private IP addresses from the public. So it can be both a security device and also a network sharing type of device. VPNs, of course, allow you to create an encrypted tunnel to a host, or for a host to create an encrypted tunnel through an internet or broadband connection to a company server. There's several ways to get to what we need. In this case, I have a shortcut to the server manager on my desktop, but if you don't have one, you can go to Control Panel and Administrative Tools, and then the Server Manager. And I just have shortcuts on my desktop because I use these items frequently, Administrative Tools and the Server Manager. But in the Server Manager, once it comes up, you can install roles or set up new roles, remove roles. You can set up features or remove features. You can modify group policy. It's collecting data. Let's wait a few minutes here. Okay. I'll open this. Notice here's the GPMC, Group Policy Management Console. If I look at roles, here are the current roles my server is playing. So I am a domain controller with the 5 operations master roles, DHCP, Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol server, and I'm a DNS server so far. What I want to do is add a role, and I want to configure routing and remote access to enable both a NAT server and a VPN server. So I'm going to say add roles. Go ahead and launch the wizard here. I'm going to click next. And what I want to do is add network policy and access services. So I'm going to go ahead and check that. I'm going to click next. And then I'm going to click next. And the particular service that I want to configure is going to be a routing and remote access server. So I'm going to go ahead and select that option, click next, and I'll click install. Now, one of the things that we'll have to do is we'll have to modify whatever user accounts we want to dial in over the VPN. There's 2 ways to do that. You can either edit a network access policy and grant permission that way, and then you can select in their user accounts that they get that permission from the network access policy, or you can simply grant permission on their user account object in Active Directory users and computers. So we'll look at both ways of doing that. And while it's installing, I guess I can yak a little bit about some of the features of our VPN server. Our VPN server with 2008 will support 3 basic protocols. The first one you'll see is SSTP, Secure Socket Tunneling Protocol, and it uses the SSL port, Secure Sockets Layer, port 443, to connect a host machine to a server through an encrypted tunnel. This is very useful because 443 is usually open on most firewalls because that's secure web traffic, HTTPS, or if you use SSL, a secure socket layer connection. The other 2 protocols that it supports, PPTP for older systems that may not support SSTP or L2TP. PPTP is point-to-point tunneling protocol, and it uses MPPE for encryption. And then, of course, your VPN server in 2008 will also support L2TP, Layer 2 tunneling protocol, which uses IPsec as a means of encryption and for security policies. You can configure different IPsec policies. Now, also, one of the things you'll notice when we set up NAT is that it configures a firewall. You'll be able to select a public and private interface, and on the public interface, it'll go ahead and configure a firewall. Okay, so now we've set up our routing and remote access server. Notice now under roles we have network policy and access. And let's go ahead and we have to enable routing and remote access here. Now that it's been installed and configured as a role, I'm going to right click and I'll say configure and enable routing and remote access. And this will give me the capability or access to setting up both a NAT server and a VPN server, or in our case both. Now notice the options here. I could choose to set up just a dial-in VPN server. I could choose to set up just a NAT server, network address translation. I want to do virtual VPN and NAT. We'll do both at the same time, try to kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. But also what this will do is anybody who dials into our server and creates a VPN connection, through that encrypted tunnel, they'll be able to access via our NAT server the private network, the local area network. They'll even be able to access the internet through their connection to our server. They already have access to the internet if they're making a connection over broadband, of course, so that's kind of a moot point, but just to show you what the combination of VPN and NAT would do. So let's go ahead and now we have two interfaces here for our VPN connection. Select the network interface that connects to the internet. In this case, where I have a number assigned via DHCP, this represents the address that I would get from my internet service provider. This is where I connect to the internet. So this is DHCP given to me by my ISP. This, on the other hand, is a static IP address. And that's where my DHCP server, my DNS server, all of those things are set up on that static IP, and in this case also my NAT and VPN server. So it's very important that you select the proper interface, and the reason is because the wizard's going to configure a firewall on that interface. So in this case I want to select my DHCP interface. This connects me to the internet. That's where we'll place the firewall. Now, the next question in the wizard, how do you want IP addresses to be assigned to remote clients? Automatically or from a specified range of addresses? If you choose automatically, what you can do is configure a scope on your DHCP server to service those requests. And that's okay, but I'm going to choose this particular option from a specified range of addresses, and the reason is because it will reduce some traffic between my VPN NAT server and my DHCP server. And what this does is it'll just pull from an internal database that you configure. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a scope here. And I'll set up 192.168.8200. I want to make sure that it doesn't overlap or conflict with the range of IP addresses that my DHCP server is handing out, which stops at 100, and then 192.168. You can choose how many connections you want to allow. The maximum number of connections I'll allow is going to be, let's say 21. Of course, the last valid IP would be 254. The first fellow would be 1, but on my DHCP server, my scope is from 1 to 100. So I just want to make sure that these don't, I don't want to create an IP conflict. So okay, because I will be translating this traffic onto the network. And all right, we're going to go next. Now this is asking me, do I want to set the server to work with a radius server? Now I could configure a radius server. And what a radius server does is it allows you to tie together multiple VPN servers, or routing and remote access servers, and configure them all with a single, remote access policy, or a central remote access policy. Sort of like group policy. We've been talking about group policy and we've experimented with it, seen how it works. So you can set up group policy in a domain controller and it replicates out and controls security throughout the whole network. Well, that's what Radius does. I can set up a remote access policy on a Radius server, and then I would configure all my routing and remote access servers to use that Radius server as a central remote access policy that would govern all of them. But in this case, we'll create a standalone NAT or VPN server. I'm going to go ahead and say finish. And we'll just click on OK for our message here. Get our nice little clock animation here. Please wait while routing and remote access services finishes initialization. And the routing and remote access service is a very full-featured service. Not only can you do NAT and VPN and dial-up servers, it functions as a full-blown router. The router protocols. And we'll open up some of the bits and pieces here and take a quick look at them. What we're interested in is under IP version 4, but I guess let's start out here. Network interfaces. Here's my private and my public interfaces, and I can see where they are and which one's connected. Let me kind of scroll this over a little bit, and I'm going to go down here to ports, and you can see the ports that you can connect under. Here's SSTP ports, and each one of these has the capability to host a connection, and then that it would become active when someone dials in over that port. So in this case, here's my secure socket tunneling protocol. Let's go down, scroll down here, and we'll find some PPTP. Here's my point-to-point tunneling protocol for older machines. And then here are some more sockets waiting for connections, layer 2 tunneling protocol, L2TP. So it depends on which type of connection I would select with my client. Now I can see here that I have no remote access clients connected yet. So let's keep moving on down. If I had configured a remote access policy, I'm going to go ahead and do this. We'll launch NPS, and I'll show you what I'm talking about when we talk about a remote access policy. Give it a moment to add the snap in. Now there's two ways to do this. I'll do both. Only one way is required, but I'll do both just to show you. There are default remote access policies, and we could always create a new one. If I wanted to create a new one, I could right click and say new, and I could give it a new policy name. And we'll call it policy. We'll try to be a little more descriptive there. New remote access policy. I guess that was redundant. RAP policy. But do you have a RAP policy? Okay, and then we could add, in this case, different users and groups that would be governed by that. There we go. Domain users. Okay, yeah, a little bit less, little bit too much power there. All right, domain users, and let's go ahead. We can choose by default whether access will be granted or denied, and we can apply multiple policies. I'll just go with the defaults. We can set the time people can dial in, when they're allowed to dial in, when they're not allowed to dial in. In this case, this would be my new RAP policy. Now I'm going to delete that. I'm going to use the default policy that's in place, and I want to show you something. What you want to do is, by default, it's to be more secure, it's set to deny access. But I'm going to set it to grant access in this case, and I'll click OK. And you can have multiple policies applied, and the last policy applied is, provides the end result here. I want to go and enable this, and I want to say grant access. And that'll be enough because by default, user accounts in Active Directory are configured to control access through a remote access policy. So our network policies here. But just to show you the other way of doing things, let's go to Active Directory users and computers, and in Active Directory users and computers, let me go find my administrator account. Here's what we'll use to connect here. If I go to the dial-in tab, notice my options here. Control access to NPS network policy. I can deny access, which would override that policy which was denying but is now granting access. Or if I had not changed that network policy, I could check allow access, and that would allow me access to dial in to my VPN server. Let's just look at a few more things. I'm going to go down and click on or select the IP version 4 node here in my management console, and just look at some of the options here. Under General, I could add new interfaces. If I had added a new NIC card in my multi-home machine, I could add routing protocols, dynamic routing protocols for routing. I can get a little bit of information. Let me pull this back here and look at the IP addresses and the incoming and outgoing bytes and any kind of filtering that's going on my interfaces there. I can go to static routes, and if I wanted to add a new static route, I could, and actually add that static route entry to my routing table. I can also show my IP routing table, equivalent to a show IP route command from the command prompt. You can see where my traffic's going. I can configure a DHCP relay agent. Now, if I did this, remember a DHCP relay agent allows you to send DHCP broadcast traffic, which is normally defined to a subnet and does not traverse a router. It would allow you to send that to another subnet. Now the exception is, if your router is RFC 1542 compliant, it will allow DHCP Discover Broadcast to go from one subnet to another. But in this instance, no. So we could set up a DHCP relay agent, and in that case, we could configure either one of these interfaces with the static IP, and it would listen, like say if I wanted to configure this interface, it would listen for a DHCP Discover Broadcasts. And the hop count threshold in this case by default is set to 4, but it would relay those packets. And I've selected an interface. Let me go ahead and... Now in this case I don't really want that, but I would also want to configure it with the static IP. Say it was 192.168.100.100, which is... that is my DHCP server, but it's also this server. So in this example, it's sort of useless because I'm relaying DHCP Discover requests to myself. But in other words, just pretend that that's another IP address of another DHCP server on a different subnet. Well, our relay agent would sit here on this subnet and listen for this DHCP discover broadcast, and when it heard it, it would send them to the IP address of a server on another subnet. It would have already in its memory that particular. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this here because I don't want a relay agent set up. In this case, I have a DHCP server on the subnet, but you understand that's what that would be used for, and that way that you could have a DHCP server that would serve more than one subnet through those relay agents and that relay agent service. Internet Group Management Protocol here. Again, I could add new interfaces or group tables. And then here's my network address translation. Let me go down here, and again, I could select my interfaces. And let me show you, here's where you can gain some access or control to the firewall. I can choose to enable NAT on this interface, address pool, services, and ports, choose what I allow or what I will not allow through. Incoming and outgoing traffic. So there's a full selection of filtering that's capable, and a pretty good firewall that's installed with network address translation or NAT when you install or configure NAT. Okay, now that we've gone through all these things, let's go ahead and make a connection here. So we'll hop on over to our Vista Ultimate Workstation and Client. Okay, now let's hop on over to our Vista Client Workstation, and we want to create our VPN connection. So now let's assume that we're a workstation or a client, a laptop that's been taken from our organization or from our workplace, and maybe we're in a hotel room halfway around the planet, or just a location far away. The first thing we would do is connect to the internet via our broadband connection. So if we were in a hotel, we might be using their wireless connection or some type of broadband connection at whatever other place we were at. And then if we needed to connect to our company's or our organization's network, once we connected to the internet, to broadband, and had our physical IPs, we'll create our encrypted tunnel with our virtual IPs. So I would click on the Start menu. I want to go to Connect to. This is one of the easiest ways. You could also right-click on my network places and configure it there, but it's probably easiest just to use the wizard. And I want to say Set up a connection or network, and I want to say connect to a workplace. Notice my options here: set up a wireless connection, dial-up connection. But in this case, I want to configure a VPN, so I'm going to say connect to workplace. Next. And then in this case, you can dial directly if it's a private telephone line, or use my internet connection. I want to set up a VPN because chances are that's how I would be connecting, using broadband. And the only real safe way to do that would be to use an encrypted tunnel. So in other words, a VPN connection to a VPN server. Set up an internet connection for continuing, and in this case, we'll assume you already have an internet connection. Our internet connection is represented by the LAN in this example. So what you would need is to get from your administrator or your internet service provider, you would need to get the public IP of your company's NAT and VPN server. So in this case, the public side of the IP address would be represented by 192.168.100.100, and that's going to be, it would probably be a class A, so it might be like 64 or 65 dot something dot something dot something if it were a class A address. But you would need to get that and input that in on the client side so that you could actually contact the public side and get the physical IP address of that VPN server. And we'll just call this Pirates ARG as our connection. And let's go ahead and go here. Username. Now the account that we enabled dial and access on is the administrator account. Now in real life you'd never want to do this because that would be a pretty risky thing to dial in with administrative or enterprise admin credentials. But it's okay for this example. What you'd want to do instead is create separate accounts that were configured with permission for remote access. So I'm going to go ahead and type in the password. And if I want, I could put the domain here, or I could also put it here. And then notice this is grayed out when I do that. So either way, but I'm going to go ahead and click on create, and it will try to connect, and then the connection's ready to use. So now if I want to connect, I'm going to click on start menu, I'm going to go to connect, and I'm going to right click, and I'm going to say there's my pirates.arg connection. I'm going to connect to pirates.arg. Here it's asking for my credentials and password. I'm going to go ahead and say yes. Now by default, we're not going to create an L2TP connection, but we'll look at some of the ports, the virtual port setup. Okay, successfully connected to pirates.arg. I'm going to go ahead and click on close. And then once I do that, notice that pretty much let me get on here and bring up a command prompt. Notice that I can ping. So even though I would be connected across the internet in an encrypted tunnel, like through my VPN encrypted connection, I have access to things on the local area network. And with network address translation and routing setup, I can also go beyond that a little bit. So in this case, I'm actually going out to the internet through my local, on the other side of my VPN, through that local area network. So it's routing traffic to Yahoo. Let's do this real quick. We'll look at network properties, and I'm going to go to manage network connections. Notice here's my VPN connection right here. And just look at some of the properties. Point-to-point protocol settings, security, require secured password, use a smart card. Under networking, the type of VPN, automatic. I can choose PPTP over VPN if I want to explicitly specify using PPTP with MPPE for encryption for older systems or compatibility with older systems. I can specify L2TP with IPsec if I were to do this, and then I could modify my IPsec settings. I could use a pre-shared key or a certificate generated by a certificate server for authentication. I'll leave that on automatic. And then sharing whether or not I would allow other users on this computer or workstation to connect using that VPN connection to my network or my organization's network. So just some of the settings there. And I'm going to go ahead and close this and close this. And we're going to hop on over to our VPN server and look at the connection. Okay, now we've jumped back onto our Windows 2008 server. And we're going to look at our VPN connection. And under ports, I'm going to go ahead and click on status, and we can see that here's an active connection for PPTP. Point-to-point tunneling protocol, which was selected by default. And this is what's going on this port. And as you can see, potentially we could have dozens of SSTP, PPTP, and L2TP clients connecting to this one VPN server. Here's our active connection. If I go down to remote access clients here, I can actually see the client that's connected and the account they're using. So it's the Pirates administrator, the administrator account. I could choose to disconnect them if I thought for some reason they were a security risk or there were a problem. I could reset the connection, refresh. But as you can see, they're again on both the client side on Vista and also on 2008, we've logged in and created that secure encrypted tunnel over PPTP.